At the galactic center, power radiated like gravity itself. The Zarnathi Empire, ancient and vast, had no challengers. No equals. Their rule was so entrenched that most species born under their flag didn't know the concept of freedom. Only compliance, hierarchy, and inevitability. They didn't just control the stars, they wrote the rules of existence within them. Thousands of systems paid tribute, willingly or not, and any resistance had long been reduced to myth. The Empire's banners hung above worlds that hadn't seen a native sky in generations. Every breath, every trade, every flicker of light in space was taxed, monitored, sanctioned. Their fleets were colossal. Planet killers, siege formations, annihilation commands, terms coined not in fiction but in documentation. Their war engines were built in orbital crucibles the size of moons. Diplomacy was a formality to justify conquest, and peace was a tactic, not a goal. Entire species disappeared not in war, but by simple imperial decree. History was a tool, rewritten in every cycle. The Empire stood unshaken not because no one had ever resisted, but because every resistance was made an example. Ruthlessly. Publicly. Atop this towering power structure sat the Grand Strategium, a council of 12, each with dominion over sectors the size of galaxies. The Emperor no longer needed to speak. His silence itself carried command. His gaze alone was a verdict. When whispers came from the frontier, strange disappearances, silent systems, convoys gone dark, the Strategium barely reacted. To them, it was noise. The Rim territories were volatile by nature. Piracy. Faction skirmishes. Rogue AI. Nothing the system-wide enforcement armada couldn't contain. Reports followed. Then entire sectors stopped reporting. The Empire responded with protocol. Task forces were sent. No responses returned. Surveillance drones failed to launch. Deep space relays self-destructed under internal code corruption, an impossibility under Zarnathi encryption. For the first time in centuries, a tremor entered the Council's tone. But even then, they didn't acknowledge threat. That word implied parity. They believed in extermination, not war. And if something needed exterminating, it meant they hadn't noticed it until now. That would change. So they blamed internal rot. Accused governors of sedition. Technicians of incompetence. When a core world trade fleet went missing, 200 ships, escorted by 4 war-class dreadnoughts, they quietly sealed the archives and fabricated reports of a route collapse. No public statements. Control meant narrative, and narrative meant power. Let the outlying species believe the Empire was still flawless. Let the people believe they were safe because fear was the truest form of order. In private, though, fear crept like a virus. For the first time in recorded Zarnathi history, black-level meetings were held without logs. Even among themselves, they spoke in ancient dialects no machines could interpret. They consulted the Oracle cores, super AI from before the Empire's rise. The cores gave no answers. Only silence. Some said they refused to respond. Others believed something had severed their connection entirely. Tactical theories emerged. Cloaked fleets? Multidimensional raiders? Rogue Zarnathi engineers with forbidden tech? All dismissed. None fit. Whatever was happening didn't follow any known doctrine. The attacks weren't chaotic, they were surgical. Too precise to be random, too widespread to be local. No communications. No demands. No identities. Ships destroyed before they were even scanned. Defense satellites turning against their own. Biometric locks overridden as if the attackers were pre-coded. It wasn't a rebellion. It was deletion. Still, even cornered, the Council refused to utter the term enemy. That would imply legitimacy. They preferred anomaly clusters. Code phrases wrapped in false confidence. But deep in their private simulations, disaster models played out and offered one consistent result: unchecked loss within 10 cycles. Collapse within 50. Extinction probability? Rising. Some suggested isolation. Retreat. Consolidation of core systems. Others demanded retaliation, but against what? No locations. No targets. Just blank spaces where their power used to exist. One counselor dared speak of ancient records. Old species, forgotten in war. Terrans, he said. Humans. The room fell into stillness. The name was banned, erased from imperial script over 4 centuries ago. Their homeworld glassed. Their colonies burned. Their survivors scattered. It had been a brutal war, yes, but the conclusion had been absolute. The Empire had made sure of it. And yet, the counselor was silenced, stripped of title, imprisoned. Fear masked as anger. The Emperor did not look at him, but the chamber knew the name had meaning. Even buried under centuries of victory, humanity left a wound that never fully closed. Not because of their strength, but because of their refusal to surrender. Still, no formal action was taken beyond internal lockdowns. The border was deemed unstable. Resources rerouted. Trade silenced. Civil unrest labeled treason. The outer worlds began to whisper that something was coming. Something even the Empire didn't understand. And then, just as quickly as the disappearances began, a message reached the core. Only 3 words. We never left. The message was dismissed as a fabrication. A trick. Some deep space cult invoking extinct ghosts. Yet, moments after its arrival, 3 listening outposts at the edge of Sector 12 ceased all function. Not destroyed, just void. Not even wreckage remained. The stars above them blinked back with empty indifference. Every automated protocol failed. Retrieval ships sent to investigate never returned. All tracking data ended midstream as though the universe itself rejected their presence. Imperial doctrine insisted on control through information. When they no longer understood what was happening, fear didn't show in confessions, it showed in silence. Commanders stopped submitting reports. Mid-ranking officers abandoned posts under excuses of technical failure. The Empire's core worlds began to lose their view of the frontier, like a great darkness moving inward, devouring from the rim. By the 6th cycle of disappearance, the strategium could no longer deny a pattern. What troubled them most wasn't the number of destroyed systems, it was the precision. Each strike severed logistical arteries, fuel depots, hyperspace gates, command relays, supply corridors. But there were no planetary bombardments, no civilian massacres, no propaganda messages. No claims of conquest or liberation. Just complete, untraceable erasure. One damaged scout ship did return. Its hull looked like it had been cut open, not blasted. No signs of battle debris. Life support was intact. The pilot, barely alive, repeated one phrase before dying, "They see in silence." The onboard recorder had a few seconds of footage. Just enough to ignite a wildfire in Imperial intelligence. Ships, dozens of them, hovering with unnatural stillness. Matte black, no identifiers, no heat signature. Some larger than any dreadnought the Empire had ever built. Their formation wasn't standard, it was organic, shifting like a single organism, pulsing with silent coordination. It was a ghost fleet, absent from sensors but visible to the naked eye. Analysis yielded no answers. Materials unrecognizable, energy signatures unreadable. Their propulsion systems didn't match anything on record. No FTL trails. No subspace echoes. It was as if they bent space itself to move. Entire scientific divisions were commissioned to make sense of it. None did. The consensus was horrifying. They weren't using known technology. They were using principles not yet discovered by the Empire. Despite mounting evidence, the Empire still refused to declare a true threat. In the eyes of leadership, acknowledging something unknown was worse than being attacked. They deployed the 6th Legion to investigate a suspected incursion zone. 22 capital ships entered the Red Har expanse. None came back. A single distress ping escaped the collapse, broadcasting coordinates that were deliberately designed to mislead. A trap. And the Empire walked right into it. Some began to theorize. Could this be humans? Survivors of Earth? Impossible, the records said. Earth had been destroyed, its remnants sterilized. The colonies tracked and eliminated. Yet the idea took hold in the shadows. The oldest among the Zarnathi remembered the war. They remembered how humans didn't fight like others. They didn't obey strategy, they broke it. Their weapons were crude, but their minds were unpredictable. They didn't seek dominance. They sought defiance. A quiet panic spread among the older caste. Some began purging archives, deleting references to the Terran conflict, hoping to sever the trail. Others hoarded what they could, fearing the return of something more dangerous than an enemy, an idea. Because if humans had survived, and had hidden all this time, then their silence was not weakness, it was preparation. Out on the rim, strange patterns emerged. Ships disappeared, yet the stations they were meant to reach remained untouched. Automated mining facilities continued production but began shipping to unknown coordinates. Navigation systems were rerouted by codes no Imperial AI could read. Intelligence believed someone had infiltrated the Empire's spine. But there were no break-ins, no access logs. It was like their systems were cooperating willingly with something else, something more efficient. Entire communication networks went down not with explosions but redirections. Messages delivered late, or never. Even personal devices began to receive fragments of language unrecognized by translation matrices. A whispering code. When decrypted, each said the same thing: the shadows remember. To make matters worse, alien species long subjugated began refusing orders. Not in rebellion, but in quiet non-compliance. They claimed no knowledge of the attacks but expressed hope, almost reverence. One ambassador from the Trilkan Unity, a race crushed by the Empire 300 years earlier, said during a closed session, "Perhaps your sins have finally found their architects." He was executed, of course. But his words echoed. An information blackout was ordered across all border sectors. No civilian traffic. No interspecies diplomacy. Silence. But the silence worked against them. Without knowledge of what was happening, panic took root. Worlds began going dark not from attack, but from mass desertion. Ports emptied. Trade routes dried up. And in the vacuum, rumors flourished. Stories emerged of black ships that spoke no language, broadcast no threat, and yet moved with unerring purpose. Ships that warped in without announcement and vanished just as easily. Survivors from isolated systems claimed the ships never fired first. But when fired upon, retaliation was immediate and absolute. Not a shot wasted. Not a trace left. One system, Elver Prime, managed to capture a human escape pod. The being inside was dead, but genetically Terran. The Empire's denial collapsed internally. Humanity had returned. But no one knew from where. No signal trails. No FTL distortion. No diplomatic channels. Just sudden, methodical destruction. Each move crippled the Empire in some way: resource denial, production collapse, psychological shock. They weren't fighting for territory. They were targeting legacy. Erasing the idea of the Empire itself. With no visible leadership, no centralized command structure, the human fleet seemed to operate like a single living entity, adaptive, decentralized, precise. It had no anthem, no symbol, no name. The only trace it left was what it removed. In deep vaults, the last unpurged records of Earth were reopened. And those who read them understood. This wasn't revenge. This wasn't war. This was a reckoning written in silence, delivered without a face, and spoken in the language of extinction. Long before the Empire claimed victory, before Earth was turned into a scorched monument of dominance, there were signs that humanity wouldn't vanish as easily as others had. The Zarnathi believed in overwhelming force. They measured extinction in statistics: civilian deaths, infrastructure loss, cultural erasure. On paper, Earth was eradicated. But humanity never treated war as survival. For them, it was evolution under pressure. While cities fell and orbit burned, contingency plans activated that the Empire never discovered. Before the final bombardment, fleets of refugee ships broke into deep space, masking their trajectories through collapsing wormholes and decoy data trails. The Empire assumed those remnants perished. Uncharted space was believed uninhabitable. But the Terran exodus wasn't disorganized. It was the birth of something new. Cut off from Earth, from supply chains, from familiarity, the surviving humans were forced to abandon everything but their will to persist. Generations passed in silence, drifting through sectors no other species dared chart. Entire colonies were built inside hollowed asteroids, hidden inside gas giants, cloaked within dying stars. They didn't just survive. They adapted. Over the decades, they rejected the concept of rebuilding the old. They weren't Earth anymore. They weren't a nation. They were a purpose. The lessons of their fall were passed down not as history, but as doctrine. Never be seen. Never be predictable. Never let the enemy choose the battlefield. And above all, never forgive. They didn't raise monuments to the dead, they built weapons to speak for them. They viewed visibility as vulnerability. Silence became strategy. Secrecy became strength. Their new civilization had no name, no central government, no capital. It operated through networks of decentralized AIs, memory-embedded protocols, genetic imprints passed through bloodlines. They developed technologies that didn't mimic the empires, they bypassed them. Their ships didn't rely on faster-than-light drives. They used space compression, folding locations like paper. Their weapons didn't aim for destruction. They aimed for total denial, eliminating not just targets, but the systems enabling them. An orbital forge capable of building fleet-class warships could be collapsed into a singularity. A databank holding centuries of imperial knowledge could be rewritten to believe it never existed. Their war wasn't about superiority, it was about deletion. Where the empire evolved through conquest, humanity evolved through necessity. Without allies, without support, they trained their children to think like tacticians. To question every signal. To predict the unpredictable. Their fleets had no admirals, only mission architects. Orders were embedded at a neural level, command distributed through quantum relays immune to interception. No chain of command, no kill switch. Every ship was independent, yet in sync. If one was lost, 10 others adjusted without pause. They learned from every loss. And they never made the same mistake twice. Early scouts encountered remnants of civilizations the Empire had also tried to wipe out. A few survivors remembered the humans, not their faces, but their resistance. Some offered aid, others begged for protection. Humanity accepted neither. Not because they were cruel, but because trust was a vulnerability they couldn't afford. Their response was always the same: observe, record, move on. But they watched. For centuries, they watched. The Empire, drunk on its own power, never noticed the cold eyes behind the distant stars. It mocked the primitive defiance of a dead species, while unknowingly stepping over the sensors of a hidden world. It expanded blindly, believing its dominance was absolute, not knowing that every expansion point was logged, mapped, and marked by Terran intelligence. What the Empire saw as dominance, humans saw as coordinates. While the galaxy turned, while empires rose and fell, the exiled children of Earth never stopped building. Their manufacturing wasn't planetary, it was mobile. Shipyards hidden inside wandering planetoids, weapon forges riding solar winds. AI farms running simulations for centuries, predicting every possible response to a reawakening. Their return wasn't a question of if, it was a matter of alignment. The moment conditions reached optimal decay. And when they did, humanity wouldn't announce itself. It would act. Their culture abandoned names and nations, identities and borders. Everything became mission. Their myths were mathematical. Their heroes were engineers. And their language had no word for mercy. Not out of cruelty, but because they'd learned that mercy was a luxury for those not yet hunted. They weren't seeking retribution for Earth. They didn't want the galaxy to remember them. They wanted the galaxy to understand one thing: consequence. The idea of returning to the galaxy as it was held no appeal. They weren't interested in alliances, negotiations, or declarations. Their legacy would not be carried by survivors, it would be carried by absence. One by one, the systems that cheered for Earth's fall would be silenced. Not because of rage, but because of conviction. For every city turned to ash, a starport would vanish. For every child buried in orbital rubble, an imperial capital would go dark. Even among themselves, humanity had purged sentimentality. Emotional attachments were archived but never revived. Grief was a memory. What remained was focus. They weren't ghosts of the past. They were the result of being buried alive and digging upward for generations, not into the light, but into the void. Some factions within humanity questioned the final approach. Whether such methods made them as monstrous as their former executioners. But the answer was always the same: the Empire taught us what they value: fear. And fear is the only language they listen to. The Terran return was not a resurgence. It was a quiet, long-prepared termination order, signed not in ink, but in vacuum and silence. As their fleets aligned, final activation codes were passed not through words, but through harmonics. A single pulse, echoed in dark matter across the fringe of mapped space. In less than 1 hour, every Terran vessel activated simultaneously. Not a signal was intercepted. Not a launch detected. But in the hours that followed, the Empire began to bleed. The galaxy would soon discover that humans didn't die with Earth. They just became what the Empire feared most, an enemy that waited. An enemy that learned. An enemy that came back not to be remembered, but to make sure the Empire never would be. The Empire initiated a countermeasure codenamed Operation Iron Sky. 10 fleet groups were mobilized to the frontier, reinforced with AI-enhanced warships, planetary suppressors, and deep-range scout probes. Every commander received identical orders: find the anomaly, identify the fleet, and neutralize. No further analysis. No questions. Obedience was a survival instinct in the Empire. But confidence was the real poison. They believed any threat could be crushed under mass, firepower, and doctrine. They were wrong. The first engagement was a disaster. Fleet Group Argentum entered Sector X-91, a suspected conflict zone. Within 6 minutes of arrival, all ships lost contact. No weapon discharges recorded. No emergency beacons activated. Black box fragments recovered days later showed a pattern: no external impacts. Instead, entire ships shut down mid-flight, systems locked in place, crew paralyzed. No evidence of boarding. No survivors. The data was redacted and rewritten as a system malfunction. The truth was considered too destabilizing. 2 more fleets vanished in similar fashion. The loss rate forced the Strategium to hold emergency war protocols. Dozens of planets were placed under martial law. Border sectors entered full lockdown. Civilian populations forcibly evacuated. Massive propaganda campaigns flooded the Empire, spinning the disappearances as joint military exercises, resource reallocation, or foreign sabotage. But the public sensed something different. This wasn't defense, it was desperation. Imperial intelligence launched Project Mirror, deploying thousands of surveillance drones with stealth optics to track unknown activity. Within weeks, half were lost. A handful returned. What they recorded sent panic through command channels. Entire moons converted into moving shipyards. Artificial nebulae used to cloak fleet movements. Human vessels moving with zero latency across spatial barriers. Every prediction model failed. Standard physics didn't explain it. One analyst wrote a single sentence in her report before going silent: "They aren't bound by our rules anymore." Some in the Empire began to demand answers. Internal debates fractured once solid alliances. Governors hoarded resources. Nobles recalled their private security. Infighting spread. The Senate accused the Strategium of incompetence. The Strategium blamed sabotage. Imperial morale faltered for the first time in centuries. For a regime built on fear, fear turning inward was a death spiral. The Empire still hadn't seen a human. Not a face. Not a voice. Only ships. Cold, quiet, unrelenting. Strategic targets blinked out like dying stars. No pattern visible until you zoomed out far enough. Then the strategy became horrifyingly clear. The human fleet wasn't fighting battles. It was cutting out the nerves. Removing communication hubs. Decapitating logistics. Systems that once took centuries to build vanished in hours. Entire planets were left untouched, but isolated. No hyperlanes. No orbital gates. No supplies. They weren't conquered. They were abandoned. Forgotten by the Empire that once demanded their loyalty. Some systems turned to rebellion, others to starvation. The Empire had no ships left to respond. Every attempt to defend one world opened 5 others to attack. It was a losing game of attrition they hadn't played in millennia. One they never prepared for. In desperation, the Empire authorized the use of forbidden technologies. Quantum destabilizers, black hole munitions, biovirus clouds, all deployed. None effective. Human fleets never gave fixed targets. They appeared without warning, executed precision strikes, and vanished. They never took territory. They didn't need to. Their presence alone corrupted the Empire's entire concept of control. A breakthrough came when a captured Imperial scout ship survived a skirmish. Its internal sensors detected a momentary signal, unfamiliar but repeated in known Terran rhythm patterns. When decrypted, the phrase was short, * protocol vengeance confirmed. Sequence 3 initiated. * there was no doubt now. It wasn't just war. It was judgment. Still, the Council refused to admit it publicly. They couldn't allow the myth of humanity to rise again. So they doubled down. More fleets. More weapons. More fear. But their power was brittle. Built on intimidation, not resilience. Human strikes grew bolder. Mainline systems experienced communication delays, then failures. Entire network relays shut down in cascading sequences. AI management cores began to glitch, some turning on their own assets. No virus detected. No breach confirmed. It was as if the Empire systems had been waiting for the command to betray them. Eventually, patterns in these collapses revealed something worse. The sabotage wasn't recent. It had been planted years ago. Possibly decades. Before the first strikes. Before the Empire even realized humans still existed. That was when the Strategium understood, this war hadn't just started. It had been happening for a long time. Quietly. Invisibly. Everything they were experiencing now was just the final phase. Planetary leadership centers were hit next. Not destroyed. Erased. Residences, databanks, bloodlines, gone in a flash. The Empire began to lose not just resources, but identity. Dynasties with records stretching back thousands of years ended with no record of their death. Cities fell silent with no rubble to mark their fall. They were removed from existence like dust swept from a slate. Entire species that once served the Empire began defecting, sensing the fall. The Empire's response was erratic. Punishments were doled out, not as deterrence, but as panic. It only hastened collapse. Whispers of human intervention now spread in the open. Despite propaganda, the myth couldn't be contained. The humans had returned, not as survivors, but as executioners. Those who remembered Earth spoke in hushed tones, many with guilt. Some declared allegiance. Others begged for clemency. The response was always the same: none. The humans made no declarations. They didn't acknowledge surrender. They gave no demands. Because they didn't want to be heard. They wanted to be understood. They were not claiming the galaxy. They were unmaking its tyrant. From the outside, the human fleet looked mechanical, merciless, machine-perfect. But beneath the precision was not AI dominance or cold programming, it was human will distilled into strategy. Each action was rooted in memory. Every target selected with historical weight. The campaign wasn't tactical conquest, it was psychological collapse. Their silence was not absence of message, it was the message. The Empire had taught them that only power is respected. So humanity responded with perfected power, minus the arrogance that once got them crushed. Their new form of warfare wasn't emotional, ideological, or imperial. It was principle enforced with finality. Humanity didn't return for justice. Justice would imply belief in the system that failed them. They came to ensure the failure never repeated. Their mission was self-contained, time-sealed, and invulnerable to diplomacy. They didn't demand recognition. They didn't require validation. Their survival wasn't a symbol, it was a tool sharpened by time, exile, and clarity of purpose. The Terran fleet structure didn't include ranks in the traditional sense. The hierarchy was synthetic, shifting per objective, governed by situational input processed through decades-evolved war algorithms. Human minds remained central, augmented but not replaced. Their consciousness embedded into dynamic command matrices, operating at speeds no biological strategist could achieve. They didn't outnumber the Empire. They outthought it. They didn't overpower systems, they invalidated them. Every operative was trained from birth to see the universe in variables. Emotion was archived, but not erased. It remained as a ledger. Pain became a trigger for precision. Loss transformed into targeting data. Their fleets operated like immune systems. They didn't chase glory, they removed infections. And the Empire was their final plague. Their combat doctrine was asymmetry by default. They avoided direct engagement unless required. Collateral damage was minimized not out of mercy, but efficiency. Empires burn better when they collapse inward. Human action was calculated to create cascading failures, economically, socially, technologically. One destroyed relay meant thousands of voices unheard. One collapsed trade hub caused starvation 6 systems away. One erased bloodline rewrote power dynamics across entire quadrants. No speech. No flame. Just precision-struck silence. Every time the Empire responded to a human strike, they moved predictably, mobilizing ships, rerouting resources, sending waves of drones. And every time, the humans had already accounted for that movement cycles in advance. Imperial ships would arrive to find nothing but echoes. By the time their analysis completed, the next target had already fallen. The psychological effect was devastating. Imperial commanders began doubting their own systems. Were the fleets real? Were the attacks fabrications? Were they fighting shadows or projections? Their most trusted AIs began offering conflicting assessments. Trust degraded. Orders conflicted. Some ships turned against others mid-battle from phantom sensor readings. Human-designed subroutines didn't need to hack systems. They exploited belief. In a structure built on certainty, introducing doubt was more destructive than fire. To understand how this fleet operated, one would have to understand what humanity became. They were no longer a civilization. They were a distributed, purpose-bound intelligence made of survivors, memory, and an absolute unwillingness to ever be dominated again. Their children were taught not patriotism, but historical consequence. They were trained not to hate, but to remember. Every curriculum was embedded with the Empire's crimes. Not for vengeance, but for design. When a system was targeted, it wasn't because it was important now, but because it was important then. Every act was rooted in a map of cause and effect spanning centuries. One orbital academy destroyed because it trained the executioners of Earth. One communications nexus erased because it coordinated the blockade that ended their last colony. Every act of the past left coordinates. Now humanity was executing the ledger. Some among them questioned the scope. Was the erasure of the Empire truly the only way? But the answer always circled back to the same principle: existence isn't owed. Survival wasn't gifted to humanity, they clawed it from the void. The Empire didn't show restraint when they crushed Earth. They offered no terms, no compromise, no warning. So the return would mirror that. There were no debates inside the Terran command grid. Only execution. This wasn't revenge in the emotional sense, it was consequence delivered with full awareness of cost. And that awareness sharpened every decision. Mercy was not withheld out of cruelty. It was discarded as an inefficient variable. The Empire had already shown what it did with mercy. It turned it into weakness. Humanity had no space left for that gamble. Where other fleets displayed banners and anthems, the Terran ships bore no symbols. Just hulls painted in light-absorbing black, surfaces unreadable to scanners. Some vessels pulsed with field cancellation nodes, actively deleting their presence from enemy records. A ship could enter and exit a sector without existing in any known database. Even when destroyed, they left no data trail. Wreckage disintegrated within hours. Autopsy impossible. Replication futile. Every ship was unique. Built for its purpose, completed that purpose, and was discarded or recycled on command. It was an entire civilization weaponized against memory. Not to be remembered, but to ensure no one ever forgets what they did to provoke it. No territory was claimed. No population was subjugated. Human forces didn't garrison planets. They didn't install governors or demand tributes. Once the target objective was achieved, they vanished. Systems left behind were given no instructions, no new rule. They were simply left. Free. Leaderless. Uncertain. And that uncertainty did more damage to imperial structure than any conqueror ever could. The Empire couldn't function in a vacuum of control. That vacuum was now spreading faster than any imperial fleet could plug. As a final doctrine, Terran units operated under the rule of disappearance. If a ship or operative failed a task, no reinforcement was sent. No rescue. Failure was consumed internally and used to upgrade strategy. Every lost unit refined the whole. Every mistake was permanently resolved. They didn't mourn losses. They learned from them. This was humanity in its final form, not a people, but a response. Not a resurgence, but a calculated reckoning. They didn't emerge from the shadows to be seen. They emerged to make sure the ones who put them there would never see anything again. It began with silence, not from the human fleet, but from the Empire's own systems. One by one, automated networks shut down without warning. Communication hubs disconnected from mainline cores, planetary logistics desynchronized, and entire systems began operating in isolation. No enemy was visible, no attacks were reported, but the effects rippled like collapsing scaffolding. Governors couldn't contact Central Command. Civilian transports halted in orbit. Requests for orders turned into static. What had once been a hyper-connected dominion suddenly became fractured fragments orbiting an empty throne. Imperial infrastructure wasn't just damaged, it was bypassed. Entire resource networks were rerouted by unknown protocols. Mining drones began shipping materials to coordinates with no record. Energy distribution systems suddenly drained into dead sectors. When officials attempted overrides, the systems refused. Manual control was impossible. The codes had been rewritten. Worse, rewritten in the Empire's own encryption. There was no breach. These changes were authorized by the system itself. Internal suspicion spread faster than any enemy incursion. Governors accused each other of treason. Sector lords deployed personal fleets to protect assets. Borders closed. Civil wars broke out across 5 outer sectors. None were instigated by the human fleet, but all of them were accelerated by its presence. Fear no longer came from an outside threat, it came from the belief that the Empire's foundations were compromised. Paranoia took root. Trust collapsed. By the time Imperial High Command recognized the pattern, over 30 planetary economies had failed. Trade routes were ghost corridors. Currency destabilized. Merchants abandoned official channels. Pirate factions swelled. Black markets exploded. And through it all, the Terran fleet remained invisible. They didn't need to fire on these systems. They simply disconnected them from the structure that made them imperial. On worlds where the Empire had ruled through force, resistance erupted. Entire species once broken under the boot of imperial conquest began taking control of their systems. Not through revolution, but through quiet defiance. They stopped responding to commands. They stopped transmitting status reports. They stopped fearing punishment. They saw that the Empire had no reach. That the throne they bowed to was surrounded by nothing but empty space. Some tried to signal the human fleet, offers of peace, allegiance, information. No response came. Terran protocol ignored all forms of diplomacy. These were not negotiations. This was a process. A sequence. Offers of surrender weren't dismissed, they were irrelevant. Humanity wasn't listening to pleas. They were checking names off a list. As the collapse accelerated, the Empire's core began to rot from within. The strategium fractured. 2 counselors declared emergency sovereignty, triggering a power struggle that split their remaining forces. Dual command chains issued contradictory orders to surviving fleets. Some units defected, others turned rogue. Civilian populations evacuated on mass scale, but escape lanes were choked with debris and system shutdowns. Entire refugee convoys vanished into dead space. Meanwhile, human attacks increased in precision. They no longer disabled systems. They erased the records of those systems ever existing. Central archives began reporting inconsistencies. Worlds that once held millions showed no data. Command logs had entire months missing. Star charts were altered subtly, removing evidence of colonies now destroyed. This wasn't just war. It was unwriting. In the Empire's intelligence division, final analysis reports circulated. They showed a disturbing theory. The Terran fleet had not launched from any one location. Their origin points were scattered. Multiple launches, synchronized to act as one. That meant one thing: they had been seeded years in advance. The entire galaxy had been living beside them. And never noticed. One system, Reala's Prime, managed to detect a Terran fleet for 6 minutes before being hit. What they saw contradicted every known doctrine of warfare. Ships that altered form mid-flight. Hulls that phased between physical and non-physical. Beam weapons that bent around matter to strike targets behind cover. The planet launched a counterstrike. It never landed. Their projectiles froze mid-air, stopped by spatial distortion. A second later, their planetary core destabilized. No explosion. No crater. Just atmospheric collapse and silent extinction. It wasn't just power. It was mastery. The psychological toll broke what remained of central control. Soldiers refused deployment. Pilots abandoned ships mid-flight. AI command cores shut down voluntarily, refusing orders. Even the Empire's elite, those bred and trained from birth to serve without question, began showing cracks. Some executed superiors. Others destroyed their own ships. The Empire's power wasn't just dying, it was being turned inward, made to devour itself. Desperation led to reckless decisions. Forbidden weapons were unleashed. A gravity bomb collapsed an entire moon, accidentally wiping out 3 loyalist systems. A viral AI program intended to combat Terran systems infected Imperial data cores instead, shutting down hundreds of administrative sectors permanently. The Empire's own hands began breaking its spine. And still, the humans said nothing. No ultimatums. No demands. No broadcasts of victory. Just one action after another, unfolding in perfect timing, each step pushing the Empire further into chaos. A rhythm of destruction not driven by hate, but by sequence. Executed like a process. Some began to question if it was really humans at all. Perhaps not survivors, but a machine evolution built from Terran remains. Perhaps the silence was not discipline, but absence. Whatever they were, they never spoke, never responded, never stopped. The myth grew, the humans had become the void. At the center of Imperial space, the final realization took shape. The Empire wasn't losing a war. It wasn't even fighting one. This wasn't a conflict. It was closure. And it was already written. The death of the Empire didn't come with explosions or dramatic last stands. It came with absence. Worlds that once echoed with orders fell silent. Ships that flew banners of dominance now drifted, forgotten relics in the dark. Even the most fortified citadels became tombs, unbreached, unbombed, simply bypassed and left to rot. The collapse wasn't a single event. It was a vacuum, swallowing hierarchy, legacy, and belief all at once. The center did not hold. It dissolved. What remained of Imperial command existed in fragments. Scattered warlords, fractured fleets, confused AIs looping broken orders. A handful tried to rally. They declared provisional governments. They promised retaliation, restoration, remembrance. No one listened. There was no structure left to enforce compliance. The chain of command was memory. Those who still believed were either isolated or delusional. The Terran fleet didn't chase these remnants. They let them linger, corroding under their own irrelevance. In a final act of desperation, the Empire's last functioning superconstruct, Overseer Nexus Zero, launched a signal beacon to the outer colonies. A call for loyalty. It promised stability. It framed the Terran return as galactic terrorism, a threat to order itself. The signal never reached its destination. Somewhere along its path, it was intercepted, rewritten, and sent back. The new message was 2 words: we remember. That was the last recorded transmission from the core. The systems once ruled by Imperial decree fractured into autonomous zones. Some embraced the power vacuum and declared independence. Others descended into internal collapse. Local wars erupted. Species long enslaved turned their weapons inward, seeking retribution or dominance. Chaos wasn't seeded by the Terrans. It was a natural outcome of a regime held together by fear. Once the fear was gone, so was the order. In former Imperial sectors, rumors spread faster than data. Myths about the Terran fleet blurred into legend. They said the humans could become invisible. That they could collapse a sun with a thought. That their leaders were not even alive, but constructs of vengeance made flesh. That their ships didn't fly, they bent space around them. No one could confirm anything, but the stories didn't need proof. Belief alone carried more weight than truth. But in quiet corners of the galaxy, something else began. Not war. Not rebellion. Memory. Species that had once been conquered started recounting the first days of Imperial oppression. Stories that were banned under penalty of death were spoken aloud. Names erased from records were recarved into stone. Even in places untouched by the Terran fleet, change rippled. It was not humanity's presence that transformed the galaxy. It was the absence of the Empire, and the terrifying awareness that the one force capable of toppling it had been watching all along. Among the surviving Imperial elite, a few attempted to flee. They sought refuge in distant sectors, cloaking themselves in false identities. Some tried to bribe their way into exile, offering ancient knowledge or artifacts. A few managed to escape detection, for a while. But eventually, every one of them vanished. Some were found adrift in space, their vessels stripped of systems, untouched by violence. Others were simply gone, ships missing without a trace. It became clear, the Terran fleet didn't forget. It just waited. Across the ruins of Imperial strongholds, strange anomalies appeared. Carvings in alloy, inscriptions written in languages that predated the Empire. Symbols. Coordinates. Not warnings, records. Terran markers. Each left in the same format: system name, date of conquest, date of erasure. No flourish. No commentary. Just the facts. These markers became known as silent verdicts. Entire pilgrimages formed around them, species visiting to see where the Empire died and the truth began. The remnants of humanity didn't emerge from their ships. They didn't take territory. They didn't demand tribute or allegiance. They simply ended things. Their war had no climax, no victory speech. No flag raised over fallen ruins. When the mission ended, they withdrew. One by one, Terran vessels vanished from sensors. No celebration. No aftermath. Just disappearance. What followed was a galaxy in reflection. Without the Empire's grip, old grievances surfaced. Justice, revenge, sovereignty, all competing. But beneath the surface, a common awareness grew. There were limits now. A boundary not of law, but consequence. No one knew if the humans still watched. But everyone behaved as if they did. New governments formed cautiously. Coalitions based not on domination, but shared memory of what unrestrained power created. The very concept of empire became a curse. Systems outlawed hierarchical governance. AI councils replaced monarchs. Data transparency became a cultural value. Not because of idealism, but survival. The message had been received. Some tried to reach out to the Terrans. They built beacons. Sent peaceful transmissions. Offered apology, respect, curiosity. No answer came. Their silence wasn't cruel, it was complete. The Terrans had said everything they needed to say through action. Their purpose wasn't communication. It was finality. In deep space, where gravity curves and time thins, there are signals. Faint. Nearly undetectable. They don't say words. They don't broadcast commands. But they pulse at intervals too precise to be natural. Some believe it's the Terrans, watching, preparing, or maybe just ensuring nothing like the Empire ever grows again. They were not liberators. They were not monsters. They were what comes after forgetting the cost of cruelty. And now, no one forgets. Long after the last Imperial signal died, echoes of the Terran campaign still reshaped the galaxy. Not through force, but through a new kind of caution. The idea of unchecked expansion, once celebrated as progress, became a warning. Empires that had once plotted to fill the vacuum left by the collapse now moved with hesitation. Not because they were afraid of humanity's return, but because they knew it was never truly a departure. The Terrans didn't conquer. They calibrated. Their absence wasn't peace, it was pressure, waiting for imbalance. Researchers from surviving academic enclaves scoured destroyed sectors for traces of the fleet. They found almost nothing. No data cores, no discarded technology, not even fragments of hull material. It was as if the fleet had removed itself from history, leaving only results. One report detailed that gravity signatures in former battle zones were altered at the molecular level, evidence not just of destruction, but of engineered removal. They hadn't simply killed the Empire. They erased its scaffolding. The most advanced civilizations attempted simulations. They tried to reconstruct the Terran war model using existing AI and known strategies. All simulations failed within seconds. The results didn't show defeat. They showed structural incompatibility. The logic driving Terran decision-making didn't match any known military or political paradigm. It was like trying to predict lightning with clockwork. What remained clear was that the Terran campaign was not designed for victory. It was designed for termination. Attempts to reverse engineer what little data remained produced fragmented results. Some weapon concepts were theorized: mass nullification fields, cognitive suppression waves, dark logic warfare, but none reproducible. A few minor factions, hoping to imitate Terran silence and fear-based strategy, launched their own assaults. They failed instantly. Silence without precision is confusion. Terror without control is collapse. The Terrans weren't feared because they were unknown. They were feared because they always knew more than their targets. Political alliances that emerged post-Empire all carried one trait: restraint. Gone were the empires, syndicates, and dynasties. They were replaced by cooperative networks focused on shared sovereignty. This wasn't altruism. It was trauma-encoded caution. No one wanted to draw attention. Systems limited military expansion. Research into advanced weaponry slowed. Aggression became taboo not by treaty, but instinct. Even the most warlike species shifted toward measured diplomacy. They didn't want to be next. On the edge of explored space, where unclaimed sectors remained untouched, faint anomalies persisted. Signals with no origin. Distortions with no energy source. Dead systems suddenly sparked back to life, then went dark again. Probes sent to investigate were either lost or returned with corrupted data. Some believed the Terran fleet had merely relocated, moving deeper, evolving further, watching. Others argued they had no central location, that they were scattered by design, able to reassemble at will. No consensus formed. But the speculation alone ensured one constant: fear governed ambition. Species that once ruled entire sectors began recording their own atrocities. Not for glory, but for accountability. Archives were opened. Mass graves were uncovered. Apologies issued. It wasn't about redemption. It was protection. If the Terrans were watching, perhaps transparency bought time. Truth became currency. Across hundreds of systems, monuments rose, not to humanity, but to the fallen under imperial rule. Symbols carved in metal, unpolished, left deliberately raw. They didn't beg forgiveness. They acknowledged cause. In some sectors, Terran artifacts were rumored. Not weapons, messages. Fragments of language buried in code, appearing in old imperial systems years after the collapse. Short, direct, clinical phrases. Your record is not forgotten. This sector is cleared. Balance remains. No system claimed authorship. None traced the origin. The Empire had always believed in legacy. But legacy was what the Terrans dismantled, one data string at a time. Where the Empire sought permanence, the Terrans created instability for anything built on dominance. Their methods had a single through line: enforce consequence, then leave nothing behind to challenge it. Civilizations adapted. Education systems changed. History was rewritten to include Terran intervention, not as heroes, not as villains, but as a consequence of empire. Children were taught about balance, scale, and consequence, not obedience. Military doctrine emphasized defense over control, contingency over dominance. No longer did fleets carry banners of expansion. They flew under anonymity, if at all. Visibility became a weakness. Power became contextual. Force became irrelevant unless guided by precision and purpose. The Terran silence remained louder than any weapon. Their strategy had not simply been destruction, it had been correction. Their campaign didn't create a new empire. It made empire obsolete. Across the galaxy, leaders spoke in coded caution. Ambitions shrank. Borders froze. Not because humanity ruled, but because it proved no one else should. And still, no Terran voice was heard. No human showed their face. They didn't build temples or rename systems. They left no manifestos. Only outcomes. Some theorized they had dismantled themselves after the mission, having fulfilled their purpose. Others believed they merely went deeper into the uncharted, evolving beyond the need for structure or visibility. But a single truth endured in every surviving culture: humanity had returned not to claim, but to conclude. Not to rise again, but to prevent anyone else from making the same mistake that cost them their world. They had no flag, no anthem, no throne. Only the memory of fire. And the will to end what tried to bury them. Time passed, and the Terran fleet became myth, untouchable, untraceable, unchallenged. But myth didn't mean forgotten. Across the remnants of the galaxy, every major power, every fledgling alliance, every cautious civilization carried the imprint of their presence. Policies were shaped around what might trigger another return. Development slowed, expansion plans cancelled, militaries downsized or reframed as defensive coalitions. A single unspoken truth governed all strategy: never become what the Empire was. Because if humanity came back once, they could come again. And if they did, it wouldn't be to negotiate. Researchers continued to theorize their existence. Some suggested the Terrans had integrated themselves into quantum layers of space, existing in nonlinear form, able to observe without interaction. Others argued they had simply transcended their origin, becoming a collective protocol, part human, part machine, part principle. Regardless of theory, no one dared to find them. Expeditions to deep space were regulated. Probe launches restricted. Exploration crews had protocols to shut down and retreat if anomalous Terran signs were detected. In private, a few voices began to question the morality of it all. Had humanity become the very tyrant they destroyed? Was silence any better than oppression if it ruled through fear? These questions remained philosophical, never public. No one wanted to answer aloud. Because the answer didn't matter. The result did. The galaxy was no longer ruled by domination. It was ruled by the memory of what domination cost. And that memory had a name: Terran. The absence of governance became the governance. Systems maintained order not through enforcement, but caution. Trade routes were cooperative. Disputes resolved quietly. Intelligence networks monitored not for rebellion, but for resurgence of imperial tendencies. Entire civilizations implemented preemptive ethics oversight for government decisions, auditing policies not just for outcome, but for risk of repeating history. Fear had matured into foresight. Not idealism. Not utopia. Just controlled survival. What terrified leaders most was that the Terrans never asked for anything. No territory. No tribute. No acknowledgement. They didn't profit from the collapse. They didn't step into the vacuum. Their goal had never been power, it had been imbalance. Wherever hierarchy became threat, they cut it down. Without emotion. Without warning. Without identity. That level of restraint made them more dangerous than any warlord. The galaxy could understand vengeance. But cold, calculated consequence delivered without ego? That couldn't be negotiated with. It could only be avoided. Over time, patterns emerged. Species that had once served the Empire and later aligned with reformist efforts found themselves untouched by anomalies. Peaceful worlds, transparent administrations, collaborative systems, all seemed to thrive. But planets with hidden ambitions, or those who attempted secret consolidation of power, those experienced sudden collapse. Not from war. From entropy. Entire computational grids failed. Resource lines broke. Decision trees spiraled into chaos. Every audit revealed no enemy. Only internal failure. The message was clear. The Terran campaign had ended. But its enforcement hadn't. In the outer edges of space, certain zones became known as echo fields. Places where no probe returned. Where physics misbehaved. Some said these were Terran red zones, territorial by principle, not politics. Areas left untouched as reminders. Not protected, but quarantined. Whatever lay inside them, no one tried to claim. Not because they couldn't. Because they shouldn't. Eventually, a generation emerged that hadn't known the Empire. They only knew stories, fragments passed down through filtered history. To them, the Terran fleet was less real than legend. But even they walked carefully. Because the systems their ancestors rebuilt were shaped by absence. Their homes stood not on the ashes of conquest, but on the edge of it. Peace existed not by treaty, but by constant, invisible accountability. Historians began calling the new galactic era the post-silence cycle. An age not of expansion, but of containment. Civilizations no longer spread outward, they turned inward, strengthening what already stood. Innovation shifted from weapons to resilience. Technologies focused on environmental recovery, sustainable infrastructure, and fail-safe design. Not out of benevolence, but because the alternative had already been shown. The price of ignorance was extinction. The Terrans became more than a species. They became function. A self-correcting mechanism embedded into galactic history. Like a code beneath the skin of every system, reminding every sentient being what happens when power exceeds balance. They didn't establish a new order. They dismantled the need for one. In the oldest surviving archive, deep within a cold, drifting vault orbiting a neutral star, a single entry exists. Unmarked, isolated, disconnected from the rest of the database. It contains no visuals, no coordinates, just text. A simple entry in thousands of languages, auto-translating to the reader's understanding. It states, there will be no next empire. No signature. No date. No confirmation of origin. But everyone who reads it understands. Humanity didn't rise again. They made sure nothing like them ever had to.